Hi there and welcome to this, the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. And it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And it's an absolute dream to be here talking to you about the challenges that the security community faces around raising awareness, influencing behavior, and fostering an appropriate organizational culture where security is truly valued. For those of you that are new to the show, let me just explain briefly what the format of the show is. Basically, off the back of research I've done over the last 6-7 years around what I call rethinking the human factor, I've identified a whole range of disciplines which are probably disciplines that we've not really had a great deal of exposure to in the security community when it comes to the challenges of education and awareness. I've then gone out and found people through my research who are either academics or practitioners or ideally a combination of the both, and asked them to come into the studio or to get onto Skype and have a chat with us and share their insights in the challenges they found around awareness, behavior and culture outside of the security industry. And we also invite our listeners to drop us an email and come and join us on the show to sort of like give us an overview of the last 3 episodes and what they found interesting and share their own insights. And if you want to be one of those guests, then it's really simple process. Drop us an email to podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Let me just repeat that for you. Podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Drop us an email, let us know that you'd like to come on the show, let us know what you like about the show, and I'll get in contact and we'll see about, getting you into the schedule. So, what have we got lined up for you this week? Well, I think over the last couple of podcasts, I've actually been mentioning this guest that we've got on the show today. Her name is Char Sample. Now, Char and I were introduced to each other over lunch at a conference a number of years ago. And what I do remember from that conversation is not eating much of my lunch. Now, that should tell you enough about how great that conversation with Char is. Char is amazing. And we really, we were introduced because the person that made the introductions understood where I was going with my research and the sort of topics I was raising, but also understood Char's passion for the challenges around the human factor and the direction of her research. And when we got our heads together, it was absolutely awesome. So it's been a little while coming, but we've got Char on the show. And so without any further ado, let's get on with the interview. Welcome, Char, to the show.
Thank you, and good morning or afternoon, whatever it is over there.
Yeah. Well, we're moving into the afternoon, and it's absolutely fantastic to have you on the show. It's early in your part of the world, isn't it?
It is a little early, yes. But now the sun's starting to come up, so it doesn't seem so early.
It doesn't, no. And we've caught you at the best time. This is like when you got high energy levels, and we're like, okay, let's grab those energy levels and let's share them with all the listeners here on the show. So, Char.
Yes.
We ask all our guests to sort of explain a little bit about where they are, what it is that they currently do, and then a little bit about what was the journey that you've been on in life to get you to the point that you're currently at. So do you want to just share with us what it is that you do?
Sure. I work as a contractor for a company named ICF, and we have me as an embedded researcher at the U.S. Army Research Labs down in Adelphi, Maryland, which is the main lab because there's several different labs in different locations across the country. And I have 2 focus areas, but the one I think we're most interested in today is the research into how cultural values play out and leave digital artifacts online that we kind of don't realize that we're doing when we're online.
Okay.
And the journey, well, I'm going to try to give you a very abridged version of it because
okay.
I could spend the entire podcast talking about the journey to get here. So.
Okay. Well, let's hear your history.
So I have a varied history. I worked for my first 10 years in the engineering in general or technical industry as a software developer. And I moved away from that when I got into internet security back about 20 some years ago. And I became an integrator and learned how all the pieces fit together. And then after a while, I realized, I think I might be a researcher because you see problems that are, you can kind of keep seeing the same problems repeating themselves. You think, maybe I have a solution. And it was as a researcher that I realized I had the unique experience of writing all these ideas for funding and then getting funded for somebody else who had doctor in front of their name. So then I went back to school. Doctor.
Yeah.
So So, and while I was doing my studies, it kind of came to me that maybe I should look at the human piece of this, that we keep doing the same things over and over in cybersecurity. We keep saying the same information about training. We say, oh, we got to train the user's the weakest link. I've heard every possible reason about why the user's the problem, and not one good way to try to fix the problem. Everybody keeps coming back to the same thing. Train the user. Well, we've been doing this for 20 some years and we're not getting anywhere on this. So I thought maybe there's something wrong with how we're approaching this, and maybe we should make it a little more user focused and a little less technology focused. But how do we marry the two together so that the people who are in power right now in cybersecurity will listen? And that is how I sort of stumbled upon cultural values. And when I did that, there was a researcher, Dominic Gus, down in Florida, who pointed me to Hofstede's work.
Hey. Brilliant. Yeah.
And Dr. Gus was actually very, very helpful in getting all this going, because everyone knew that when I went to do my dissertation, I wanted to do a quantitative dissertation. I didn't want to get caught up in all the narratives of a qualitative one. So Dr. Gus said, oh, you must look at Hofstede's work. And so I did. And I said, oh, great. He's operationalized the data for me. Wonderful.
Yeah. It is a fantastic database.
So I made a little discovery about these, having worked in cybersecurity for over 20 years, I made a discovery about many of the cybersecurity people that even though they understand to great level of detail how a specific attack works or how a specific service works, they're terrified of numbers. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but they get so wrapped up in learning about how to parse down to the bits and bytes of what has happened in an attack. They lost track of the fact of how simple math and statistics work. So they get very, when you start talking numbers to them, they actually sit down and listen, because now they can no longer say, oh, well, that's just what you feel.
Brilliant. Yes. Go on, carry on. I'm loving this all the way.
So when I did my dissertation, of course, I wanted to be able to statistically show that there was a relationship between cultural values and a specific online negative behavior, which in this case was the defacement of websites by hackers that were purporting to have patriotic or political views that they wanted to espouse for the recipient to see, how they're so proud of their country, or they're so proud of their movement or whatnot. And in some cases, it's even how proud they are of their tribe within the country.
Yeah.
But the goal was to really see if there was any matchup at all with Hofstede's values, to see if I would get a hit on any of the 6 dimensions.
Yeah.
And it turned out that, yes, I had hits on 2 of the 6 dimensions. And this was just a really cursory look, not cursory because it was a dissertation, but it wasn't, I didn't have the volume of data that I have since encountered.
Right.
So the findings on it were actually quite stark, and it kind of inspired me to want to do more. And the funny thing is, when we were all practicing to defend, and I got up and I was talking to one of my cohorts who was defending on something else in wireless. He was so enamored with the subject. He's like, Char, I'll be your co-researcher. I'll be your minion, whatever. Just make this work. So once we get through this graduation thing, we'll keep researching. So his name is Dr. Andrei Karamanian, and we nicknamed him Dr. Dre for short.
Okay.
So Dre and we actually followed up and did several other studies after I did the initial one that we had published, where we started looking at not just how attackers are doing things, but how patterns amongst defenders, patterns amongst victims, all different aspects of how this all works out. And it's just been a really fascinating journey watching this, because you can see we started off, I started off with the defacements. I was very, very lucky in 2015 that I was able to get some seedling money to pursue this further from IARPA, who's
okay, yeah,
okay, they are great.
Yeah.
So they gave me some seedling money to actually look at how culture ties in with the cyber and kinetic relationship when you're trying to do like an early warning study for predicting of war or hostile activities. And that was good on two fronts. One, it gave me a chance to do a study all by myself, even though I probably was not really ready to do that yet. But it was a success with a little bit of help. And then the other thing that was really valuable was I got access to the Zone H archives. And the Zone H archives are used to be attrition.org used to manage a bunch of website defacements.
Yep.
And since that, it became Zone H. And there's this set of data that I have had over 11 million records in it.
Okay.
So now you could start looking at things and start looking for patterns within the records. And for all the people who are out there who are data scientists and think you're just going to throw Weaker or something like that at it, no, it doesn't work. We've had several universities try to do that. There is a little bit of time in cleaning some of this data or parsing out knowing what you want to ask before you try throwing these tools at it.
Yeah.
So I've spent a bit of time with a lot of help from a lot of people on taking care of who some of the actors are, because this archive, it has a phenomenal amount of information. It has who the attacker was. It gives you the domain that was attacked. It tells you where that server was physically located. It gives you the IP address. It tells you the operating system, the software version, what attack vector was used, why they did it. All of this, each record has this information.
Oh, and you're cross-referencing this with the dimensions within Hofstede. Is that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So what happens is, like, if I wanted to do a victim study, I would maybe say, I'll look at all of the records from maybe the UK that were, all of the sites that were defaced from the UK. And then I can say, I can look at the different attack vectors and I could say, oh, for the UK, maybe and I have not done this study yet, by the way. Like I said, for the UK, I found that the most common attack vector that they were a victim of was maybe SQL injection, or maybe it was DNS spoofing or something like that, right? Because they have all the different ones and a lot of them are KPEC compliant. So this is great. Or I can look at the attackers. And now the attackers require a bit of work because they just give you the handle. So you have to do a little digging to find out where the attacker's from. So then you can group attackers by country also and say, oh, these countries, and this is what I've been primarily doing, these countries seem to like to use this attack vector first. For example, in the data set, there's an awful lot of attacks by Turks. And the most common attack vector we have found with the Turkish hackers, believe it or not, was password sniffing.
Okay.
And so coincidentally, I was up at Rensselaer a couple of years back, and I was talking to some of the people in the computer science department who happened to be Turkish, and we were talking about this data because they're enamored with the data set too, and they're trying to do different things. And the one gentleman said, oh, that is so funny about the password sniffing. He said, I am a security person. I went home to Turkey to visit my father, and my password was stolen.
Okay. So I'm listening to you, and I'm like, obviously we've been talking for some time, and our interests are obviously run very, very parallel to each other. But I'm just thinking about the listeners here as well, and I think maybe let's sort of backward wind, because most of the people that will be listening they tend to be education and awareness managers or coordinators or information security consultants as well. So I'm going to try and take this back a couple of levels to where we started. And so the first thing that you sort of mentioned there was really what you're trying to do, correct me if I'm wrong here, is you're trying to say, okay, look, cultural values. You're looking at cultural values, and you're then basically looking at how those cultural values result in particular online behaviours. Okay. Does that have to be online in the sense of internet, or do you look at behaviours in terms of just how people behave internally? So, could those attackers and those victims be internally within an organisation? I'm just trying to paint this. Is this a completely online piece, or is this within networks as well, within organisational networks?
So it started off, and it primarily is online, but it doesn't have to stay that way. It's really a matter of what different researchers want to study with me at this point, because I've been kind of, it's been kind of a slow start getting it going, but it seems like maybe in the last year or so, it's really picked up some steam.
Yeah.
So yes, it is primarily online, but then we also looked at, in the IARPA study, we looked at kinetic. And one of the things that we did not do, but we still have the data from, is we kind of want to look at, do all attackers, when we're talking about nation state, do they lead with cyber, which is a fallacy that we assume in America, or do some lead with cyber and do some lead with kinetic? And it turned out that when we were looking at the data within the confines of the IARPA study, there were some countries that were clearly leading kinetic. So
right.
Yes, we're not just straight online.
Okay. So the next one is that you use the phrase cultural values. Now, I'm quite familiar with that, but do you want to explain what you mean by the phrase cultural values?
Sure. So I'll borrow from our friends, the Hofstedes here.
Okay.
It's the shared mental software that groups of people have in common. But I'll try to pull out a few examples to make it a little more.
Brilliant idea. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Okay, so let me back up for a second here. One of the things that I love about Hofstede is it points you to different sets of values. But one of the weaknesses of Hofstede, and why I use another person in addition to Hofstede, so I use Hofstede to kind of like hone me in on what I want to find, and then I use Nisbet to help give me more of a backstory or more of a narrative.
Yep.
Okay, so for example, Hofstede on his fifth dimension, which is the long versus short orientation, that associates with holistic behaviors or holism, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you look at a problem? Do you look at it in terms of you try to cut to the chase really quickly, or do you try to understand the problem in all of its complexity? And we find that in some cultures that they prefer to look at that whole complex piece and figure out all the different pieces and how they fit together, and maybe have a little difficulty prioritizing things. And other cultures may cut right to it. Mm-hmm. So if you throw the Nisbet piece over top of this and you overlay it with that, then it turns out that Nisbet mentions that in the Eastern cultures, there's this notion of people feeling like they're ropes in a net. So they have a specific rule in their whole society, mm-hmm. and they see themselves as a very important piece, even though they're all kind of an equal piece. And then on the Western society, we see things in terms of objects. So we're the ones that cut to the chase very quickly.
Yeah.
And this has a lot of really interesting implications for educators and anyone, because it turns out that when we talk about how we model cyber behaviors, we model everything in our understanding of the object view of the world. And we miss a lot of nuances and subtleties because of that. It gives us the ability to advance certain things very quickly and to cut through a problem very quickly and efficiently and come out with the correct answer at least 80% of the time, maybe 90% of the time. On the other hand, when something small goes wrong, when we have like these little glitches that happen and we can't explain it, we end up having to pull in on these holistic values. And it could possibly be that our adversary, if they hold these holistic values, they could kind of chip away at us and we not even know what's going on.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Well, that's brilliant. Okay. That's absolutely fantastic. Just to explain to the listener, correct me if I'm wrong here, Char, but in effect, what you're sort of illustrating there is how you've drawn the line between sort of, I guess, the West and the East. And obviously there are sort of cultures within the West and cultures within the East. But in effect, the example you were giving there was like, in the West, we tend to cut to the chase. We tend to save time. We tend to, get to the root of what we think is the root of the problem. Mm-hmm. In the East, they tend to take this more holistic view of things, which can take more time. Okay. Mm-hmm. But what it tends to do is to make sure that they see the much bigger picture and they see the nuances. Yeah. So if you have that cultural, that profile, the Western profile, okay, the if you design things, okay, whether that be an attack, how you defend, how you even pull together an education and awareness program, and you're designing it with that cultural profile in mind, i.e. let's cut to the chase, let's get this done quickly, let's get the 80% of things done. It's the old 80-20 rule, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you do that, okay, but, if you're applying that to an audience, an individual, a bunch of individuals who might be attackers or employees, an audience that might be employees, you're missing that 20%. And that 20% is what actually is that audience, those attackers. That's the bit that is important to them. So correct me if I'm wrong here. I remember there's a quote from Edgar Schein, who's change management. And even I think in the conversation I had with Hofstede in series 1, one of the things there is that if you don't understand these powers at play when you're designing anything, okay, whether that's an attack, how you defend, what your education awareness, if you don't understand them, you're a lot less likely to succeed. But if you do understand them, you're much more likely to succeed. Is that what you're finding within the work that you're doing, that when we don't consider these cultural factors, we're getting caught short? But where we do consider them, it stacks the odds in our favor that we're going to be able to shift the needle towards the objectives that we have.
So we are finding, to the first part of your question, yes, we are finding that the inability to take into account the cultural values has definitely impeded our progress. To the second one, we haven't gotten to the point yet to see if they are providing an advantage, but we do know that some of our adversaries, particularly the ones in Russia, they do study their adversaries' culture. And we know from, I'm going to quickly digress here. We know from their success in fake news and some of the other things that they have done in terms of influence campaigns, where they actually spend a significant amount of time studying the cultural values and fissures of their adversaries before they even launch a campaign. And as you saw with your Brexit, and we've seen with various events in the United States, that yes, this could be a game-changing component.
I mean, I think this is really, really important. It's one of the things I love about, the podcast and getting people like yourself on board is that what we're seeing there is it's like a design piece. I mean, I often use the phrase, design for success.
Yes.
Okay. And, if you ask any marketeer to design a product, okay, one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to be thinking, okay, so who am I selling this product to?
Right.
And whether that be a phishing campaign, an education and awareness campaign, how you're going to manage incidents, whatever it is, it's about understanding that all this is being done with people in mind, either as the victims, as the perpetrators, or as the middle people, the middleware that get, it all targets people. And so, what you just described there, I remember seeing an article in the Washington Post where they were talking about how criminal gangs were using these insights. They recognized it. They were using these insights to better design campaigns to break into organizations, which is what you're saying.
Yes.
You're saying exactly that. And when we talk about trying to, we're in this constant catch-up game, okay? I sometimes get the sense that what we're talking about is, we're constantly catching up from a technical perspective, but actually it's not about the technology there, is it? It's about, we're kind of to catch up with people who actually understand that at the end of the day, what's being targeted are people.
Yes.
Okay. And that you've got to understand the type of work that you're doing to increase the chances of you making success with that attack.
Yes, that's it exactly, actually. So we have a tendency to want to throw technology at the problem. But if you don't take the cultural values of the person who's sitting at the end of the computer there and who's going to be the recipient of this data, if you don't take that into account, you can at best have a partial success.
Yeah. So back to Hofstede, you mentioned there one of the 6 dimensions. I think, can you do off the top of your head what the other 5 dimensions are?
Sure.
Yeah, and just let the listeners know as well so give us the 6 and then say, okay, number 1 was this, number 2 is this, because we've had Hofstede on before and you went through some of them, but we got really stuck into a conversation on just a couple of them. It'd be great if you could share with that so listeners can think, oh, okay, right, that's what they mean, and they can go away and do some of their own research.
Okay, so I will give you this, what I call the short version of Hofstede, and I hope awesome. I do not offend either Hofstede with this, but I had to cut these down to terms that people would readily understand. So,
cool. Okay.
The first dimension is the power distance one, and that deals with how authoritarian or egalitarian is your society.
Yeah.
And the shortcut on that is Do you ask for permission or do you beg forgiveness?
That's good. I'm sure he'll go with that. Okay. He is coming back on the show, by the way. So I'm going to go, here we go. Here's the shortened version of it. And you go, who said that? Anyway. So number 2.
Number 2, individualism versus collectivism. Do you consider when you make a decision, do you think about how it impacts you and your family, or do you think about how it impacts your community or your country first? That's pretty straightforward.
Yep.
Number 3, masculine versus feminine. I think even Hofstede will tell you this is probably the worst named dimension because it conjures up all kinds of crazy images of what the people are like, and it has nothing to do with manly men and girly girls, really. Yeah. It has more to do with gender roles in a society, and it also has to deal with how you deal with conflict. Or do you deal with it directly, or do you deal with it in kind of a roundabout way, try to negotiate, do different things to avoid it?
Yep. Okay.
Again, these are really shortened versions because I'm sure Hofstede will go into great detail on that one.
Oh, yeah. Uncertainty
avoidance. There's high and low uncertainty avoidance. Are you fearful of change? If you see something new, are you fearful or are you curious? People coming into a country, I think is the example Hofstede uses in his book. Nationalism tends to associate with high uncertainty avoidance. Again, curiosity, adventurism tends to associate with the lower one. Very interesting component in this for educators. In high uncertainty avoidance societies, students are taught in the education system that there's only one right answer for a question. And in a low uncertainty avoidance society, students may be taught that there can be more than one right answer to a question. So the the outcome of this is that on one end, your low uncertainty avoidance countries tend to have more creativity associated with them because of this. Mm-hmm. And high uncertainty avoidance societies tend to have great precision in their product that they make.
Yeah. So. That's very, just listening to that, you're thinking when you do a campaign, an education campaign around information security, probably it's been designed. I know this because I experience this day in, day out, where, people are designing something and they're in a particular country. Or maybe they're spread over a couple of countries, but those countries are all sort of Western culture. And then you have, this has been deployed around the world. And actually, it's been deployed to cultures where they don't have the same values associated or at the same level, okay, as have formed the basis for the way that you've designed the education program. And the end result is, you've designed something that fits a percentage of your population, but it hasn't really fit the whole of the population. And then people scratch their heads and wonder why it's not necessarily working in the Far East, the Middle East, or or South America, quite frankly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So uncertainty avoidance, which I think ties in with anxiety as well.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating dimension, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing. People get anxious in uncertain situations.
Yes. Yeah. Some people do, and some people kind of think, wow, this is kind of cool. Let me see what I can find.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people like both, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So uncertainty avoidance, number 4. Number 5.
Long versus short-term orientation, which we talked about a little earlier. That's that holistic view versus quarterly profits and objects.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder which particular culture that one's prevalent in. I'm really not. But it's an interesting one because, again, as an industry, we often talk about the challenges that we face around education awareness and awareness behaviour and culture, and we know that you can't really reshape culture in the short term.
No, you can't.
So when your organizational culture is based upon a quarterly report, okay, where there doesn't seem to be much progress or any at all, demonstrable progress, and that really you only start to see the changes happening maybe 3 years, 4 years down the line, then you start to understand really that's the problem we've got to tackle. How the organization, when we talk about the clash between security culture, if you want to call it that, and organizational culture, part of it is even goes as far as your financial reporting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's not something that I see discussed openly in the circles that I've circulated in over the last 20 years, where that is being thought of as, how is that affecting my education and awareness program? And how we're trying to develop an organizational culture that truly values security. So yeah, okay. So long versus short termism. And
I actually have an amusing little anecdote I'd like to share, if that's all right on this. I know I'll run this a little over, but so I'm working with a colleague on another topic, and he's from Taiwan, and we were talking about the Hofstede dimensions and what I've been doing with research on that. And I said something like, "No," I said, "I kind of break the mold for most Americans. I consider myself a little bit of a long-term thinker, but I said, I know I'm not as long-term oriented as some of the Asian cultures." And so I said, I made sure that I've put enough money away hopefully there's enough money away for my retirement, maybe even be able to leave a little something for my daughter. But, if I leave with a balance of zero, I'll be happy. Mm-hmm. And he laughed and he said, "Yes, you're right." He goes, "You are much more short-term oriented than me." He said, "This gets better." He goes,
"Okay."
"My is worried that she doesn't have enough money put away for her grandchildren's retirement."
Oh. Yeah.
So,
it does.
The cultural difference between long-term orientation and short-term orientation.
Yeah.
We got a bit of catching up.
Yeah, which is interesting because it's all down into what your definition of anything, isn't it?
Oh yes.
Yeah, it's really about your definition of anything, and you're thinking, I'm quite good on this. I'd like to. That's it. Well, it's the cultural lens. I remember when I was speaking with Jan Hofstede, and we were talking about these cultural lenses, and we all have them. We just don't know we have them. Everything we digest in terms of experience goes through these cultural lenses, and those cultural lenses actually are sort of help us with, or don't help us with the defining of what it is that we see.
Yes.
And that's part of it. So in your case, a great example of, you're comparing yourself to maybe the broad culture in the West of more short-termism. You like to think you're more long-term. Mm-hmm. And then when you actually experience somebody from a
truly long-term,
from a truly long-term, you're like, oh, wow. Yeah, I'm not that long-term, am I?
That was really quite amusing talking to him. He's a great guy, but it really is quite eye-opening because even if you're cultural values, they're going to set the norm for you. And as you pointed out there, so yes, as an American, maybe I do have long-term values because I worried about my retirement and having a little left over. But as an Asian, I'd be considered very short-term. I'm here today, gone person. So.
Yeah, but that ties in very much with anything about the contribution to society. You were talking about there as being like the rope in the net.
Yes.
And that's very, that can be as an overarching sort of profile, I guess. That's a reasonably true reflection in the sense that people are, or they think about what it is that they're doing. There's obviously an interest in it in terms of for themselves, but there's also this broader understanding, I think, of the impact on society.
Yes. There have actually been some interesting studies that, so one of the outcomes of this is that these people that look at things with a holistic view, they have difficulty disentangling objects from their background, whereas Westerners tend to do better with that. They can sort out the objects, but then they miss changes to a background.
Okay.
So educators, that's I think that's kind of a key point because now if there's a subtle difference that occurs, the Westerners are more likely to miss it.
Okay. Now that is important because a lot of the differences in terms of how attacks happen are constructed, what you actually can see, if you can see anything or experience, it's basically marginal gains. These are small tweaks to something that's already happening, which basically throws off the majority of the signature-based ways of identifying something, which is, very much technology. But then when it gets to the human factor, we do tend to find it generally easier to this is how I see it. And then there's a slight change and they don't pick up on that slight change. And that's what gets them through the door.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to number 6.
Yes,
okay.
Number 6. The last but not least is the indulgence versus restraint. This is who likes to party and who likes to keep it close to the vest.
Right. Okay.
There's an interesting piece that I believe was Minkov uncovered or about this dimension, and that is that the restrained cultures tend to be better at math and science than their indulgent counterparts.
Okay, right. So I guess there's something for the listeners here. The importance of what Char's really talking about is this gentleman, Hofstede. Remember, his research was done with IBM, wasn't it, back in the 1970s? Yeah?
Yes, late 70s.
Yeah. And Hofstede did this massive piece of research while he was at IBM, and it was gathering data from, it was like a lot of countries, wasn't it?
Initially, he had 78 countries represented, and he did the first 4 dimensions. And then in 1980, I believe, Michael Bond, I think is his name. Bond is the last name, I know that. Added the long versus short dimension.
Okay.
And I don't know what year Minkov joined up with the forces there, and then they added the indulgence versus restraint dimension.
Okay. So yeah, we've got this. I think the important thing here is that this is not new stuff. This started back in the 70s, and I think one of the great things about the work that Hofstede did, and then sort of those people that have picked up this, is that over the years we've accumulated significant amounts of data. Char was talking about, the data that she has access to, and we're starting to be able to recognize patterns in there which enable us to start putting profiles together. I think it's true to say that a lot of people anecdotally will say, will agree with what the findings are. The important thing is there's data. So, and a point Char made earlier was this thing that, people can now start to explain with data what they've been saying for years. Would that be, about cultural dimensions, that type of thing, and they've got proper names to it? Would that be true to say?
It would be true to say, and sometimes when I'm in a little bit of a dark mood, I like to say that what some of what we're doing is actually kind of being like, dare I say it, Cambridge Analytica for culture.
Yeah, but the thing is, and this is the thing, Charles, with all of it. I mean, when I was having a chat with Dan Arley, and we've got Susan Winecheck who's coming on, who comes from a behavioural background as well. And a lot of what we're being able to do now is to actually be able to turn around and go, oh, actually, our guts have told us this in the past. But now we have the data which either challenges the assumptions that we've been designing everything upon to date. And I think that's very true in the cybersecurity industry, where, people talk about the motivations behind the actors. But they're motivations that come out of somebody who's got a Western cultural bias.
Absolutely. I get the biggest kick out of, as I like to say when I give the culture talk, we talk about what motivates attackers. Now, think about this for a second. Have you ever, because I know I sure have you ever done something and then months later and asked yourself, why on earth did I do that? What was I thinking? Right? And we do this. I do this all the time. And any parent who has children will tell you, they'll ask their children, why'd you do this? I don't know. So why do we think we know what somebody's thinking and why they're doing something thousands of miles away from us?
Absolutely. And I think what's the interesting piece is that we then fall in, we're basically making assumptions which are based upon our cultural lens, that we were talking about, that, how we interpret things. But we don't necessarily recognize that we do that because it's just how we've been brought up. And these are the cultural values which are really that are embedded in us from an early age, which is important because when you think about it, people start talking about organizational values and trying to embed security culture. What you're up against is all those cultural values that we've learnt since we were born.
Exactly. Hofstede brings up the point in his literature, and I know certainly other ones do too. The cultural values are very enduring because they're reinforced all throughout society. As I like to say that when I talk about culture, I'll say, it starts off, you learn your first exposure to cultural values is at home, mom and dad, right?
Yeah.
Then you go out kids go out in the neighborhood and they play. Guess what? Cultural values getting reinforced, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they go to school. Cultural values get reinforced there. They leave school. School helps prepare you for the workforce. You go to the workforce. You go to a company that probably reflects your cultural values if it's a good fit. So it gets reinforced at work. You might meet someone, you get married, you have children, and you start the whole cycle all over again.
Absolutely. And I often talk to people through that when I'm sat down with them, that whole, before if you're thinking about the security culture within you've got to understand it's all this. Because most people, it's in many ways it's unstructured, but then there are elements of structure. So for example, when you go to school, the whole structure of school education is about really it's a tool for embedding culture.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the challenge I put to everybody is like, so you got this lifelong influence on culture, shaping of culture, and you're trying to set up a security culture within your organization. Which one is going to win? One sounds like I'm really pushing a very heavy object up a very steep hill.
Yes.
Okay. And the other one sounds like, okay, the hill's got loads of rocks on it that I can grab onto and I can pull myself up. And those rocks are like the values that are embedded as part of that society. And if I understand what those values are, and this goes back to the 6 points within the Hofstede dimensions that you've mentioned, which have formed a core part of what you're doing in terms of trying to understand how behaviours are built around that and how you can therefore how people make decisions, whether it be about attacking, the decisions they make, which was on them becoming a victim, those type of things. If you can understand those and align yourself with those and design around those, then surely you're just in a better position to be able to push that needle in the right direction.
Correct.
So now that we've been through the 6 with Hofstede, let's go back to specifically the work that you'll be doing. And is there anything that you can share with us around the insights around culture and how that relates to victims? Because I think most of the people on this show, their overriding concern is that organizations invest very heavily in governance, risk and compliance. Organizational expectations are written down in policies, process and procedures. Their jobs often are to make sure that people are aware of them, which is great. I think on this show, we've completely dispelled the myth that awareness results in behavior. But, and then what they're really hoping for is that people are going to behave. And if they don't, and sometimes they don't comply because they become a victim of the efforts of somebody else in effect, to try and get them not to comply with what's required of them, what's expected of them. So as victims, how are people using that knowledge about the culture of their intended target? How are they using that to better design their efforts to compromise networks?
So I'm not really sure how they're using it to better design efforts to compromise networks, but I will share the finding. I'll share 2 things. I'm going to share the findings of a study that I did last year, and then I will also give a plug for a student that's hopefully going to wrap up his dissertation because he took the Zone H data and he did the victims for all of it.
Okay.
I took a portion of it. Now, I looked at, in 2017, I published a study on the victims of social engineering attacks. And what I found, interestingly enough, was that the countries that have the greatest association with victimhood of these social engineering attacks tended to be egalitarian, individualist, and long-term oriented. Okay,
so basically, there were the greatest number of victims were in countries where they were egalitarian.
Mm-hmm. So okay. That's the low power distance scores, individualist, which is like us, US, and long-term oriented.
And long-term orientated. So when we think about that, so long-term orientated is going to be the Far East generally. Is that right? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Individualist would be Western, but I think it'd be true to say, just like there are certain countries which are even more individualistic than others in the West as well. Okay. But that's true about long-term orientated as well. I think, we tend to sort of see things in that almost like a continent. This is a profile for a continent, but actually within each continent, there's almost like sub-profiles, subcultures in some degree or other. Yeah. Okay. And then egalitarian, which is what you talked about here is, this is the power distance.
Correct.
Piece, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So so what we're saying there is that there's a low power distance ratio. Is that right?
Yes. So what we saw in this particular study with this particular group of victims, and this was only looking at them for maybe about 4 years worth, I think, 4 or 5 years worth. What you'd want to do is put who is low power distance, who is high individualism, and who is long-term oriented out of those two.
Yep.
The relationship with that low power distance and individualism was really strong, and then it was kind of like the long-term orientation kind of fit on at the end there.
Right.
So the strongest correlation was actually with the individualism.
That doesn't surprise me.
Not at all. We kind of were speculating that perhaps in these more collectivist societies that tend to be a little more immune to this, that you may see something, or you may get, when there's a social engineering attack going on, somebody may ask their neighbor at work, hey, what do you know about? And they all say, oh no, don't click that link to get, or something like that. This again is speculation because, just looking at data.
Yeah.
But the individualist, there's clearly I'll do this. It's not going to hurt anything.
Yeah. Okay. That is very interesting. I'm just wondering how far you could take that piece of research. I mean, it'd be interesting to see. So that was the number of people that have actually fallen victim to an attack. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And, it's that individualism. I'd be really interested to understand, even on a industry sector basis.
Oh, yes. Oh, so when I was cleaning that data, I believe I looked for everything by the country name domain and made sure that the server was actually housed in that country.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I have my student right now is looking at it by he's going to look at 10 years worth by government-owned domain. So it'll be, .mil.gov per country. And he's doing the entire victims for all of it.
Wow. Okay. Because I think it's quite interesting, because when you look at culture, there's national culture, but, there are more broadly, there are a whole range of other micro-cultures underneath that. But you definitely get industry sectors with their own culture. And then even within there, one of the things that came from my research, and I hadn't really picked up on this, but then it sort of makes sense when you finally understand the bigger picture, how even like the legal profession, the accounting professions, the doctors, the bankers, etc., all these different sort of skill sets, all these people go through a process from a certain age through to the point where they actually start working. They go through an educational process, a structure. And that is a key part of forming an individual culture for that particular sort of profession and people that are within that. And so, so it's not surprising that when you get to an organization which has a legal function, a finance function, a marketing function, all the other functions, that actually those functions almost have their own little cultures.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then actually when you start to understand that and you think, okay, so which ones of these actually, what are the main prevailing values in those different function areas, that it'd be, understanding then, okay, so those values are more likely to, based upon the research, be associated with somebody who's going to end up being a victim because of the decisions that they make, which are driven by their cultural values.
Right.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Now, I'm going to bring you to, I'm not sure if your research extends this far, but how important is the role of values in decision making? When people find themselves in the position of sat there and going, "All right, okay, I've got this choice. They've got this choice here between A and B. A involves complying with the organisational policy and what's expected of me and what I've done my training on and I've said I'm going to do. B is the more tempting route." What's your? I've got strong views on this one, okay, but I do, and I don't want them to to bias what you've got to say at all. But in your experience, the role of values, the cultural values that you've been talking about, in terms of actually influencing behaviour, how big is it?
I cannot quantify it, but it is huge. The reason I can't quantify it is because we haven't come up with the weights, I guess, for each of the different components of what comes into decision making. Because clearly there's a psychological component, but culture even influences what is considered normal in terms of the psychological component. When you give the example of someone who wants to make a decision, and it's like, should I ask for permission, or hey, if I take this chance, I could make a lot of money and this will be good for us all and I'll be the hero. Well, those are definitely, you can see those mapped directly to cultural values there. I'll be the hero and get the accolades. That's your indulgence versus restraint. That's your indulgence aspect. Taking the risk, that's going to associate with your power distance, as well as your to an extent your individualism, and also to an extent your lower uncertainty avoidance. So.
Yeah. Okay. So listen, that's perfect. What Char's just done. See how you had that scenario, and she's basically being able to map it to the 6 dimensions that Hofstede talks about. So, and I think it's that ability to be able to explain things. I think once we've got even more data, then to pump even more data behind that, because then one of the big challenges has got to be for our listeners that I think often in the past people come up with ideas which seem to gather weight, but there's no actual evidence. And you can take that great idea to the board, and the board are probably going to ask for where's the evidence,
right?
And I think that's one of the big big problems. So interestingly, actually, we've got I did an interview recently with Stella Collins, and Stella comes from an L&D background. Well, that's where she is at the moment. She was involved with banking and tech and training, including a bit around security a number of years ago. And one of the things, I call these the uncomfortable truths. Okay, right. And actually, she's really challenging the concept of learning in the sense of learning styles, audio, visual, all those type of approaches, the different things that you're using different senses to be able to teach people, to engage with people, and that some people are more audio than visual, etc. And she's really challenging it, but she's really challenging it with data.
Good.
Yeah. But it's a mantra, isn't it? It's a mantra that we have when it comes to okay, so we're going to educate people upon what their roles and responsibilities are, the threats to look out for, the patterns to look out for, etc. And we think that we're going to get better traction by, using this sort of design principle. But Stella's point is there isn't really a great deal of evidence out there which supports that. And actually, most of the evidence seems to now be pointing out that that's not necessarily, the benefit of doing that is nowhere near as we anticipate, and that it might actually be counterproductive to take that sort of approach. And I think that's the great thing we're at the moment. It's the work that people like you do, which provides the research, which challenges assumptions, but also, backs up a new direction, a new way of thinking. And, it's the same with Stella and a number of the other people that we've had the good fortune to interview on the show. So normally what we try to do to sort of wrap up the show is to ask our guests, what is it right now that's really exciting you about, I think, in relation to your work? What is it that you see and go, I can't wait to get focused absolutely on that, or I'm doing this right now and I'm bursting? Okay.
So there are actually 2 things that really have my interest peaked. One is I want to be able to take the data. I have a group of actors that I call them my selfies. They were self-identified attackers, and I profiled them by their countries for their attack vector choices. And I want to be able to see if my selfies are accurate predictors of the non-selfies, because then if they are, then I can say, we can actually do prediction with some level of fidelity on attacks. The other thing that I am very interested in is the other area that I'm researching, and that's fake news. And where does this meet with the culture piece? So, for example, both the UK and the US were victims of successful information operations. UK has come together on this. US is becoming more and more fractured on it.
Okay, so when you say it's becoming more fractured, are you talking at a government, sort of like federal level, then a state level, or are you talking that at an individual level, people are going one of two ways?
I'm talking more about, I guess, a political level and how the countries reacted. So the UK, when they found out the extent of what Russia did, plus, I guess it didn't help that Russia went after, citizens in your country too. But even before that, the UK said, we have to work together to fix this problem. United States it still has a bunch of denial around fake news. And even though it's now a hot area of research, it is one that everyone has to tread very lightly on. Because there's much like culture, everybody thinks they know what fake news is.
Partisan, yeah. It's really interesting because I remember many years ago when I first got involved with information security. So that's pre-cyber, and everybody talked about the CIA triangle, the confidentiality, integrity, availability thing, which everybody in the industry is pretty familiar with. And actually, I'd get involved in these conversations, and people would talk about confidentiality.
Yes.
Okay, and then they talked about availability, and it's like nobody wanted to talk about integrity. And when I used to challenge people, I go, well, what do you mean by integrity? Because I'm a just believer, let's be certain about what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Right.
And whenever I thought of integrity, I thought about integrity in the sense of, the integrity of the data, okay, in the sense that is the data actually accurate? And the other one is the data, if it's been gathered for purpose A, is it being used for purpose A? Or is the integrity being called into question because you're using it for purpose B, and you haven't got permission to do that? And the second one was around integrity, was integrity of systems.
Yes.
A system gets designed for purpose A, but then gets compromised and it's still being used for system A, but it's being used for purpose B.
Yes.
Yeah. And I remember when I looked at that years ago, I was like, having data stolen is really, can have a really significant impact upon not just organizations, but society and individuals within society. Having data, copied without permission. Okay, so it's not stolen per se. It's it's just a copy's being taken. That can have the same sort of impact as well. But it's the fact that the systems. A lot of people seem to get a sense that the system's that it's confidentiality. If I can compromise a system, and I can switch it from A to purpose B. So it still looks like it's being used perfectly fine for A, but I can switch it to purpose B, and that purpose B fits my personal objective. Okay, why wouldn't I do it? Right. So and that's what for me. That's what the fake news. That's what's happened with fake news. Is we've got this. We've got this system in place.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, and we're all thinking it's being used for purpose A. But there are people that are smart enough to think, well, it doesn't have to be used for purpose A. I can be using it for purpose B, which actually suits my needs more. And that's the bit I think we missed in the industry for a really long time. And across society and policy decision making, at a government and super government level, was just missing that systems can be used. It's not just about confidentiality or the availability of systems. It's how you can manipulate the systems for a purpose which isn't in line with what it was designed for and what everybody said that it should be there for. Right.
We never fixed garbage in, garbage out. And as I like to tell my friends that are trust engineers, I said, there's a quote that apparently it's an old Russian proverb, trust but verify. We put all of our eggs in trust and we left verify exposed. We can, the funny thing is this would be a whole nother podcast, what this means in terms of our systems, other systems that we have in place, because again, we had these cultural, the West pretty much developed a lot of the security technologies with their object view of the world, right? And now we have these systems that are vulnerable that people don't even realize are vulnerable to these other areas from trust but verify.
Yeah. Very interesting. I think it's a generally spot-on reflection of how the industry's developed from a very westernized point of view. And there is for me, there are strengths within that Western point of view. But if you're truly looking at looking at cyber, whether that's at a government level, intergovernment level, or at an organizational level across society, the likelihood is you need to see a much bigger picture.
Right.
And that bigger picture involves all these different cultures. And that if you don't take the time to understand the role of culture and values in terms of how you can be compromised and how you can become a victim, and how then basically you're not going to be designing it in an optimal configuration, in an optimal way. Okay, it's been absolutely fantastic to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It was certainly a lot of fun.
So even before I did the interview, I knew, because Char and I have been speaking for quite some time, that it was going to be a really exciting moment. Char's research is absolutely fascinating. For me, as somebody that looks at awareness, behavior, and culture, the cultural piece is always seen as, in some cases, when you get to understand the impact of culture upon, for example, decision-making and behaviors, you then start to see the opportunity from a theory base for how that might be exploited. When Char and I sat down to talk about the research she was up to, and I was like, oh my God, you're doing research into this. I've got a theory. It makes absolute sense. It's applied across so many other areas. But what you're talking about is how culture could, in effect, become the vector that people use to attack or to launch attacks against organizations and individuals. And really, it's basically around the fact that, culture shapes behaviors. And if you can understand that relationship, you can start to design attacks based around the cultural context of the attack location that you're going for. But also the things you really raised there as well is how different attacks originate from different cultures, and you can see a trend within that. So another thing, Char mentioned the work of Jan Hofstede, and we've had Hofstede's son on the show in series 1. And I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to get him back on the show towards the end of this series as well. So, an amazing bit of insight there. I mean, this is what we try to bring to you, something really, really unique. I'd be really interested in anybody who's ever thought about culture as being a vector for an attack, or as being almost a vulnerability within your processes and systems and people ever before. I've never come across it in 7 years worth of research. My theory was there, but I was like, God, yeah, somebody's got to be getting the data around that. And Char Sample has done it. Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. So, if you've heard anything around those sort of lines before, drop me an email at podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. So if you enjoyed the show, I really do hope you did, then how can you stay abreast of the new podcasts that are coming out and the work that we're doing here at Rethinking the Human Factor? The really, really simple way is to subscribe to your podcast feed, whether it's iTunes or Spotify. And I think we even do it on Android now. The other way that you can stay abreast of what we're doing is to join the LinkedIn group. That's right. We kicked off the LinkedIn group. I mean, the membership is growing, and every week we allow a whole new cohort of people into the group. And in that group, we're going to be sort of talking about general awareness, behavior, and culture, but also we'll sort of let you know when the new podcasts are coming along, and what new podcasts and the sort of content who we're interviewing are going to be as well. The third way to stay in contact with us and what we're up to is to go to the Marmalade Box website. And on the Marmalade Box website, you can actually register to be kept informed. We have sort of like a weekly update. And that basically is, information coming that we're going to be passing through based upon the work that we're up to and what we're doing in terms of research as well. So, 3 options for you to stay in contact with us. Now, before I actually finish, I just want to remind you of 2 things. The first one is, if you're a listener, which obviously you would be if you're listening to this, if you're a listener who would like to come on the show, who would like to talk about what they've learned from the show, and who's got their own insights that they want to share with everybody that's listening to the show, then the best way for you to do that, and we'd love you to do that, is to drop us an email at podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Let me just repeat that. That's podcast@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. And the second thing I'd just like to finish up upon is to let you know that if you find this sort of stuff that we're talking about here at Rethinking Human Factor, raising awareness, influencing behavior, and fostering an appropriate organization, and you're interested in how the sort of subjects that we're raising and introducing to you through the podcast may actually help you, then just get a heads up that we do deliver training, one-day workshop and two-day workshops all around the Rethinking Human Factor concept and the insights that we gain from the research that we've been doing over nearly 7 years now. And you can find that information by going to www.marmaladebox.com and hit the training tab. Right, so to wrap up, who is next on the show? Next person that we got on the show is, now this is a lawyer. That's right. For those of you who may not be familiar with my background, but many, many years ago, in fact, far, far, far too long ago, I did actually train as a lawyer, and a core part of everything I've done in terms of information security over 20 years has been about understanding law, regulation, contract, and how that potentially drives investment in information security, and more recently, very much focused upon how it might have an impact in relation to awareness, behavior, and culture. And a lot of my work a lot of my research basically brought me to a conclusion in terms of how a framework could help an organization potentially drive down its financial exposure in a breach. And we've raised that and we've talked that through with a number of different law firms. And actually, we've got one of the law firms who we've known for about 20 years now to actually come on the show and to talk about awareness, behavior, and culture, but with more of a legal focus upon that. You've got to listen to it. It's absolutely fantastic. And what hopefully we'll do as well towards the end of the series is get somebody from the other side of the water over in the US involved in this as well to talk about it from a more of a US-centric type of perspective. But it's really important. I just think I've never been at a conference, I've never been at a seminar which has been around education and awareness where you've actually had a lawyer get up there and talk about, what do we actually mean by that? What do the courts mean by that? How can our efforts as education and awareness people actually drive down financial exposure? So we're going to be touching on that very briefly in the next show. I really hope that you can join us there. Thanks a lot. I really look forward to see you then. Bye.